Welcome to Policy Implications. In this podcast, we dive into new research in economics and finance and ask what it means for policymakers in the real world. This season, we focus on Ukraine, the war, the economy, and the institutions that will shape the country's future. I'm your host, Olha Zadorozhna, an economist working on Ukraine and Ukrainian myself. This series is supported by the Economists for Ukraine Network and Kozminski University. Today we are going to talk about something that comes up in every political debate about Ukraine. How much support the country has actually received, especially from the United States, and where the money really goes. My guest today is James Hodson, a leading AI researcher and entrepreneur whose AI for Good Foundation has advised the Ukrainian government on economic and policy questions since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. He is also co-author of the research paper, which measures the real economic value of US support to Ukraine beyond the headline numbers. James, thanks so much for joining me.
It's wonderful to be here, Olga. Thank you very much.
So if you follow the discussion about Ukraine in the US, you hear very big numbers thrown around, and depending on who you listen to, the US supposedly spent 100, 200, even $300 billion on Ukraine. Your paper basically says these numbers are very misleading. And just to give listeners a sense of scale, your team finds that in the first 3 years of full-scale war, the actual economic value of US support delivered to Ukraine's government is around $51 billion, roughly $21 billion in military aid, and about $30 billion in budget support and humanitarian grants. That's dramatically lower than the headline numbers people talk about. So from your perspective, what are we getting wrong when we repeat these huge headline figures? And what does your paper find about the true value of US support actually delivered to Ukraine?
I think it's a very important question, and it's very timely to be talking about it, especially in the current geopolitical context, as we see Europe also deciding on its future support for Ukraine. Now, it is important to note that what I'm about to say applies not only to Ukraine, but it applies in all situations where governments are budgeting for future expenditures. It is not a special case of the US government having put aside more money than they actually eventually spent in Ukraine specifically. It is actually something that falls out of primarily how the US government does its budgeting in the first place. And so the same thing could be said about healthcare, about education, and about many other things within the US context. So I think it is important to say that US policymakers are not singling out Ukraine and specifically spending less than they intended to spend on purpose, or because they specifically want to harm Ukraine. It's a procedural problem. Now, let me dive into that a little bit more. When US policymakers, senators, representatives decide on a certain bill, which binds, legally speaking, the US government to certain actions in the future and a budget in the future, that then goes through a series of other processes afterwards. The process of actually deciding how the money should be apportioned, which agencies are responsible for those budgets, and where the money actually comes from. There is also the question over how long. So if I appropriate $50 billion for Ukraine to spend on military support, a lot of the bills that you will see in Congress are massively underspecified with respect to the details. Exactly what should it be spent on? What can it not be spent on? It might be specified in broad terms, but not at the level that you need in order to actually get an invoice and pay that invoice. So the government engine that turns wanting to spend money into actually spending money in an appropriate way through an agency is extremely convoluted. The Treasury is ultimately responsible on a week-by-week basis for actually deciding how much money needs to be spent on what accounts, for what, and where that money is sourced from. So which treasury bills are going to be issued against it, which income is going to be marked against those outflows. And as a result of that, what we've seen in Ukraine is that the willingness to support Ukraine on a political level is there. But when that actually filters down into agencies deciding which equipment to spend money on, being able to source that equipment and being able to actually package it in a way that Ukraine can use it and get it over the border, this amount effectively gets bottlenecks around it that constrains what can actually reach Ukraine and be useful to Ukraine. There's also a difference between the reality of what politicians would like and then what is possible from a military perspective, given all of the logistics and the manufacturing and the timelines involved. All of these things come together in the end. Not to say that the US specifically, again, was trying to not provide the support that they wanted to Ukraine, but that the reality of the underlying infrastructure meant that in the end, especially the military side, got tremendously constrained by availability of equipment that could readily be sent into Ukraine. And then on the other side of that, there is also the fact that much of the equipment that was eventually sent was valued incorrectly according to DoD procedures for how you decide how much something is worth. Okay, so this is the other side, which is not really about how useful it is to Ukraine. Much of this equipment would be extremely useful to Ukraine, but there is an accounting issue, right? If we like to say that we spent $300 billion helping Ukraine, then ultimately the accounting side, the valuation of each thing that crossed the border and was useful to Ukraine should match up with that. Now, it turns out that after multiple rounds of reevaluating what was sent, the equipment was worth a lot less than people originally thought it was worth. And so that causes a large discrepancy also in the numbers that we have found versus what the politicians expected in the first place and were claiming to want to send to Ukraine at the start.
And this is exactly the thing that I like about your paper most, because you don't just total up line items in the US budget, but you try to measure what you call the real economic value of what Ukraine actually gets. And for example, you adjust for the fact that a lot of the military equipment, as you just said, is older stock, partially or fully depreciated, rather than some brand new kit at replacement cost. So you also treat loan guarantees very differently from outright grants in your paper. So could you explain in simple terms how you go from Congress appropriated this much to Ukraine actually received this much economic value? And what are the main adjustments that you make in the process?
Right. So again, I do want to make clear that the values that we issue in the paper are accounting values for the equipment and support that gets to Ukraine in various ways, whether it's loans, grants, equipment, in-kind support, training, logistics, etc. Now, that's different from what is the value that Ukraine gets from using that equipment, which is a much more difficult question to answer, right? I could give you, for example, the spade from my garage, which I never use, and you managed to use it in a gold mine in order to extract all kinds of precious metals and become a billionaire. How much was my spade worth to you? A lot, right? How much was the spade worth to me? Well, still probably around zero because I had no use for my spade. So that question we don't try to answer in this paper. And that I think is a question that is really probably best left to historians to try to dissect, right? Once we understand what the final dynamics of this war will be in some years' time. What we are trying to achieve is essentially how much value did the US forego when sending things to Ukraine that could potentially have been allocated elsewhere, right? So it's more of what did the US actually lose out of this pact, from an expenditures perspective, rather than what did Ukraine gain from a capabilities perspective. Now, so there are different pieces of that puzzle. There are things like cash, money, right, which could have been spent differently in the United States on, say, defense infrastructure, education, healthcare, all kinds of other things that the US spends on, pensions, government, and so on. There are longer term obligations, right? So the US issues debt today, which is repaid at a very low rate by taxpayers over, say, 30 years, and provides Ukraine with liquidity today, which Ukraine might receive directly. There are loans. There are guarantees for other people to give loans. There is equipment, new military equipment, old military equipment from stockpiles, military equipment sent to allies so that they can send equipment to Ukraine, training, logistics, and various other kinds of support, such as intelligence support. In fact, one might argue that although intelligence support is probably one of the line items that, for instance, most trackers do not integrate at all because it's not a publicly known number, it's possibly one of the things that's helped Ukraine the most from a practical perspective in holding back Russia on the front lines. So thinking about the cash side of things, which is about $30 billion in the transfer, so $10 billion per year of the first 3 years of full-scale invasion, we are looking at, from the US, that mostly being in programs that went through USAID and that were delivered via the World Bank's peace mechanism. The peace mechanism was the largest grant-based tool for delivering money into the Ukrainian government for civilian use in the first 3 years of the full-scale invasion. Now, that 30 billion basically, or the portion of that 30 billion that was the peace mechanism, is all reimbursement. So it is cash, but it's cash that the US government puts into an account at the World Bank. And then each month, the Ukrainian government submits receipts to PwC, KPMG. They get audited. All of those receipts that are accepted by the auditors get transferred to the World Bank. The World Bank then transfers the money as a repayment, reimbursement, for the costs that the Ukrainian government has already incurred in the prior months. So it's a mechanism by which the US gives cash, but not directly, and in a heavily audited way. But it is the closest the US government gets to actually giving cash. In most other cases, the US government gives either direct equipment or guarantees and other things that are not really fungible cash in an account. So the reason I'm saying that first is that it's the largest portion of liquidity. So pensions, government functioning, healthcare workers, etc., within Ukraine. But it's also something that clearly is very difficult to have any corruption around, right? Because it's essentially double audited and reimbursed, which means that you have very, very good documentation between every payment from the Ukrainian government to a beneficiary and every payment from the US government to World Bank to the Ukrainian government via audits. Now, so that's one side of things. Now, the other side is equipment, right? So we often talk about Patriot batteries and missiles and HIMARS and ATACMS and infantry fighting vehicles and ammunition of, all different calibers. Now, when you look at what was actually delivered, it's very much, especially in the US, front loaded from stockpiles, which means that there was a warehouse somewhere. In fact, there are only a handful of warehouses really in the US that have a lot of older equipment. And especially in the beginning, it was a lot of Soviet era equipment. So equipment that the Ukrainians could readily use because they had similarly gauged armaments and cannons and artillery and so on. As the war went on, the US, just like many allies, started to run very low on Soviet era ammunition, and that caused a shift towards NATO standard equipment. And also there was a shift politically towards allowing Ukraine to use more modern kit, right? And a lot of that came from the work of Alexei Reznikov when he was Minister of Defense, really lobbying Western governments in order to get access to this equipment like HIMARS and Patriot systems. Now, on that front, what you see is that the Soviet era equipment that's given, especially in the initial phases, when you actually track it back to when it was produced, what was it used for in the US military? It wasn't used because it's not standard equipment. It was mostly for testing purposes, or it was bought for other programs in the past. And so the accounting value to the DoD was zero for most of that equipment. Again, there's a difference between how useful that equipment was to Ukraine and how valuable it was to the US military. But from an accounting perspective, it was zero. And therefore, the US forewent almost no value in providing that to Ukraine. One can talk about the potential cost of choosing to give to Ukraine as opposed to choosing to give to somebody else, but really Ukraine was the only option on the table. Also, it should be mentioned, although we don't say this directly in the paper, that through my research over that time, I discovered that a lot of the early equipment that was provided to Ukraine didn't actually work at the rates that you would imagine that equipment would work. So it might have been rusty. It might be that the electronics were not working anymore. It might be all kinds of things that prevented a lot of that equipment from being used practically in the battlefield. So there was a lot of recycling going on, a lot of salvaging for spare parts. There were Ukrainian service members that were killed by US provided equipment, misfiring and having all kinds of other issues. And so, the value ideally would take into account all of those things. But in our paper, we're quite conservative. Actually, we take into account the value that crossed the border of that equipment as it should have been calculated by the Department of Defense for their bookkeeping. As the war goes on, more manufacturing comes online, and so you start to get new equipment reaching Ukraine straight off of a supply chain of new components, and therefore the value starts to really increase, right? Especially for Patriot missiles and missile systems, which can be $1 or more billion a piece. And so, interestingly, a large portion of that 20 billion, 21 point something billion that we find in the paper is newer equipment that's come off the production line in later years. So again, I'm saying this just to give a little bit more context and insight into how this evolved also, right? Now we're at the stage where most equipment that needs to reach Ukraine tends to be heavier artillery and missiles, because they're the things that Ukraine does not produce in sufficient quantities internally. And those things tend to have higher ticket prices. They might be multi-million-dollar rockets. They might be $100 million artillery systems. And as a result of that, you see fewer packages now, but often with equipment that has an accounting value much higher than it would have been before. Which doesn't mean that it's any more useful now than it was 3 years ago, but it does change the relative value that's being transferred into the country from an accounting budgetary perspective.
And this accounting budgetary perspective is very important. Yes, it's a technical issue, but it matters a lot for the politics of support for Ukraine. And in the US debate, people often say things like, well, we've already spent hundreds of billions on Ukraine, so why should we give more to this country? If in reality, the value of what Ukraine has actually received, the accounting value to the US, is closer to 50 billion, as you say. And then this changes the way we think about the cost of helping Ukraine versus the cost of letting Russia win this war. So why do you think it's important politically and for public opinion to distinguish between these big appropriation numbers and the much smaller delivered accounting value you estimate?
Well, there are two conclusions that you can come to when you've internalized the fact that the US gave much less money than the headline figures. So you can come to the conclusion, and maybe you can come to both conclusions, but you can come to the conclusion that, well, Ukraine didn't really need as much help. Look, they managed to survive with, 1/5 of what we thought we sent them. So really, there's no need to increase the amount. They're doing just fine. And look at all the benefits that we got from them doing just fine. We've, essentially hollowed out, the Russian military capacity to only being able to hold down Ukraine on a front line and essentially have no capacity left in the rest of the country. Or you can think about it from the completely opposite side, which is, wow, we only spent $50 billion. That provides us with a huge opportunity to massively increase the amount of support that we give to Ukraine. Now, interestingly, I haven't seen much of the second argument in international media and politics, which I think is unfortunate because, or rather, let me explain my point of view why I think this is the case. I think that the US and to a lesser extent Europe saw an opportunity at rather low cost to severely erode Russia's military capability, especially in the first year to 2 years of the full-scale invasion. And they saw this happening basically with stockpiles of equipment that they would never use in any case, and with some sacrifice of expensive air defense equipment, which arrived, by the way, too late, and obviously because of that caused a lot of damage to Ukrainian cities that could have been avoided and suffering of Ukrainian civilian population, which could have been avoided. But very low cost, given the historical significance of Russia as an enemy to Western Europe and kind of Western civilization. Now, as the fighting has continued, something different has happened, which is that actually one might argue that there are, two leading armies in the world today, right? The strongest army in terms of capabilities and, per capita, I would say, is the Ukrainian army. It's the most battle hardened, and it's the one with the most advanced technology being implemented in the battlefield, and with the best outcomes in terms of what we call kill ratios, right? Per piece of equipment that's being used and per personnel. The second most effective fighting force is the Russian army, which is not so far behind the Ukrainian army, and which now has had almost 4 years to completely reintegrate and re-implement its infrastructure and systems to be a modern fighting force. So in some sense, the fact that the US and Europe have trickled support into Ukraine initially wore down a lot the system, the Soviet, corrupt, rusty system of military, and then conversely started having the opposite effect of enabling Russia to get battle hardened and copy Ukrainian technology quickly and find other technologies from allies like China and North Korea and Iran, especially if you look at Shaheds, which have enabled it to become actually a very effective fighting force, which is now even more dangerous than it was in effect at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And so one might argue that this is a huge missed opportunity to have spent more money on supporting Ukraine to be decisive, and now poses a much larger threat to Europe and US dominance than before. So especially if you match that across with, basically tensions with China and movement of very important components and goods across the world, the US and Europe are actually constrained in terms of military output. Russia is constrained in terms of economic output. And, it's not clear to what extent these two things balance themselves out or not.
Yeah, definitely. And this is very interesting what you are saying, because indeed we see that Ukraine is in need of shells and ammunition, and these are just being trickling, and it's not enough. It's never enough. But I would like us to zoom out a little bit and compare the support provided by the United States and Europe. So if you look at the Ukraine support tracker and some recent EU reports, Europe, broadly defined as Team Europe, meaning the EU member states and EU institutions, has now overtaken the US in total commitments to Ukraine, with European promises roughly twice as large as the US promises. Of course, your paper looks specifically at the US side, and at the delivered value, not just commitments. But if we try to put your real value estimates, accounting value estimates for the US side next to what we know from the Ukraine support tracker and EU reports, how does the US really stack up against Europe in terms of how much support and in terms of what kind of support is being provided to Ukraine?
So we've done a lot of work actually on disentangling what Europe writ large has provided to Ukraine as well. In fact, we were presenting our results in Brussels over the summer. Now, this is ongoing work, which is why it's not a research paper that we've issued yet, but we have results across almost all of the European countries. In fact, I saw in my inbox this morning that our research team managed to finish Sweden, which is good. Now, I think at this point we cover maybe 98% of the value that was provided by Europe to Ukraine. So I can speak, I think, fairly authoritatively on what we've learned from this, which is Europe prefers, in general, for civilian support, for budgetary support, loan-based mechanisms. Something that was pointed out very pointedly by Donald Trump in the meeting with Emmanuel Macron a few months ago in the White House. But when you look at kind of guarantees, kind of the repayable portions versus forgivable portions of those loans, upfront value that's been provided, grants that are associated with those instruments, and other cash flow from Europe into Ukraine on a non-military basis, you still get more cash commitment, as in more capital at risk, is what I prefer to call it, from Europe than the US, but only by a small margin. When you look at the military side, so equipment provided and the value of that equipment, it is important to note a caveat that Europe had much less in warehouse equipment that could be shipped immediately, and therefore had much less equipment that was old. And as a result of that, had much less equipment that was valued at zero or close to zero. As a result of that, even earlier shipments of military equipment from Europe tended to have higher sticker prices associated with it. So the overall amount of military aid provided by Europe to Ukraine is much lower by volume than what the US has provided. And bear in mind that the US has also provided guarantees to European states to basically provide exchanges of equipment and all kinds of other incentives. So we shouldn't confuse the value of the sticker price with the actual volume of the equipment that's crossed the border. However, it is true that Europe, from a budgetary perspective, has chosen to spend more money that could have been spent elsewhere on equipment of a military nature or dual use capability for Ukraine than the US has. That has been true almost uniformly throughout the full-scale invasion, which means that whenever US has delivered, the EU and UK and others have delivered also. And in general, the value of those shipments has been higher from Europe than from the US. Again, on a military level, we're talking about if the US has delivered $20 billion, EU has, or Europe has perhaps delivered 25, $30 billion. This is not still anywhere close to the claimed political numbers. Now, again, the same arguments apply to Europe as apply to the US. As I said, the US is not a special case budgetarily. Politicians make big claims, and then that needs to get washed through an actual system before it becomes a payment. And unfortunately, those payments are subject to all kinds of constraints. One quick example that I will give is the Spanish government and the Spanish MOD under Margarita Robles recently made an announcement of additional spend of 12 billion euros within the next budgetary year on defense. 12 billion euros sounds like a lot of money. until you start to look at the line items that fall under that budget, and you realize that a large part of it is a restatement of pension payments that were going to be paid anyway under a different program. And when you whittle everything down, you find that there's maybe an additional 300 million euros that are going to be spent on new military capabilities. Just one example, and I could pull out many from across Europe, and I'm sure the same thing is true in Ukraine, and I'm sure the same thing is true in Canada as it is in the US. And that's why it's important to do these studies, and that's why, we took 6 months with almost 20 researchers going through tens of thousands of documents in order to really track down, right, where did this infantry fighting vehicle actually come from? Which unit gave it up? When was it produced? What upgrades were made to it? How was it transferred? What training occurred in order to use it correctly? What spare parts need to be sent? Because until you actually get into that level of details, you don't fully realize how this works as a system, right? And the reality is that what comes out of the system on one side is usually a trickle, and it's usually a very different nature to what was intended to go in on the other side of that system. And that's just normal human processes. It's not anybody doing this because they're trying to be nasty. But it's important that we understand that, because it also gives us insight into how we can improve it and hopefully help Ukraine more in the future. Now, obviously, the US doesn't look like it's on the verge of doing its best to help Ukraine more in the future. But hopefully Europe can learn from this and create better mechanisms for actually giving Ukraine the support that it needs.
Exactly. And I think it's very important to understand where the money goes, because this affects the public's perception of, well, the support that the country gives to Ukraine. And when politicians say we're spending X billion on Ukraine, that translates into kind of a very small portion of that actually reaching the battlefield, actually reaching Ukraine. It's very different. It's very different picture. So when you look at where the money flows, both in the US and also in Europe, it seems that a lot of the aid for Ukraine in both countries' continents, this aid, it finances the industrial policies in different countries. For example, they fund new defense production lines and infrastructure, and not just in Ukraine, but also either in the United States or in Europe. And countries like Poland, for example, they have seen big investments in logistic hubs, infrastructure, and local defense industry activity connected specifically to support for Ukraine. So when you look at all of that, do you see this as a problem, that support for Ukraine is also an industrial policy for the donors, or is it actually a feature? In other words, could the fact that aid creates jobs and investment at home be actually good news for political sustainability of supporting Ukraine?
Yeah, it's absolutely a feature and not a bug. This was, I think, one of the biggest arguments that especially the Ukrainian government was taking to allied capitals in the first months of the full-scale invasion was, look, this is not just a threat against our territorial integrity and sovereignty, but it's an opportunity for you to create the necessary infrastructure and knowledge and capabilities to ensure that you are secure from this type of aggression in the future. And it was probably one of the arguments that was most well received. Maybe in Washington less than in Paris and Brussels and Munich and so on, but it's certainly it was intended that if we can spend more money to help Ukraine while at the same time strengthening our military industrial complex, it's a win-win situation. Everybody is happy. What I will say on the other side of this is that when you look at the underlying um, financial structure of big government-dependent military industrial contractors, like the Lockheed Martins and the L3 Harrises and the Palantirs and so on of this world, the financial structure and the way that they get paid, especially front-loaded contract payments and other mechanisms, mean that the cost of a missile that comes off the production line is heavily inflated relative to the cost of the raw materials and the human capital that went into manufacturing it. So, for example, Russia, which is not a particularly efficient military industrial complex, especially because of corruption and other pressures, manages to produce very similar capabilities to the US in terms of its highest end equipment at a massively reduced effective cost per unit relative to the US. So when we talk about the US being, spending almost $1 trillion on defense, right? That amount also needs to take into account the fact that a lot of it is going to corporate profits, right? Rather than into the actual capabilities that then make it into the defense. So you can't compare $1 in the US to €1 to 1 ruble, well, to however many tens of thousands of rubles, right? It doesn't work that way. And so this is why also from a NATO perspective, a lot of countries in NATO have pushed back on the US, percentage requirement, because that's not really the measure, right? The fact that the US has highly inflated corporate profits baked into the amount of money that it spends should not be enforced as a spending criteria on other countries. Now, that would be to me the biggest red flag, right? When you say I spent $100 billion, well, yeah, but effectively you provided $20 billion of actual equipment and $80 billion of corporate profit. I wouldn't call that a big win for Ukraine. But certainly from a narrative perspective in the US, people in Oklahoma and other places that are big industrial contractors for defense love the fact that that money is being spent in the US, even though it does not seem to change their support for Ukraine or their willingness to kind of create the policy space for the US government to properly support Ukraine long term, which has always been a bit of a strange or bizarre equilibrium, I would say. The other side of that, which I do want to mention, is that again the dynamics have changed a lot over the last 4 years. It started from Ukraine having very little industrial capacity, very little innovation capacity, and no real structures to deliver the types of equipment and material that is needed in the battlefield and to protect cities from within the country. Fast forward to today, and between 60 and 80% of the actually effective equipment used on the battlefield is developed and delivered from Ukrainian factories and Ukrainian institutes, labs, and other organizations. Now, what that indicates is that Ukraine now has a very well developed military industrial complex that is outputting at a rate that can support a lot of its missions, a lot of its tactical requirements. And so going forward, it's actually less of a case of reliance on European and US manufacturing capabilities, so much as it is a reliance on getting enough cash and raw materials into the Ukrainian military industrial complex to provide the exact equipment and the exact changes and innovations that are needed given the real situation on the ground. One thing that is quite clear to me is that US innovation in the military space has failed multiple times over in Ukraine. The Switchblade drone disaster is probably one of the most one of the easiest stories to tell on that front, because these were supposed to be the cream of the crop of US innovation. and essentially were entirely blocked and put operators at risk in the Ukrainian battlefield within a couple of weeks of being deployed, right? And we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of military equipment basically having no impact. Ukrainian drones don't have that same problem because any issues, and it's being already worked on, and tomorrow there will be a fix and there will be a new version of it. So, you know, by funding that kind of innovation cycle that's very close to what Ukraine needs at a lower cost basis within country, you'll get a lot more out in terms of Ukrainian capability and ability to actually survive and win the war than you would get from big military contracts over 5, 10 years being given to European and US government contractors.
Well, this is very encouraging. So, if you were advising policymakers in Washington and Europe, what would you tell them about how to design support packages so they are, first of all, genuinely effective for Ukraine on the battlefield and for its budget, and second of all, politically sustainable in the US and the EU?
Yeah, well, so interestingly, we do provide policy advice exactly on these topics to governments in Europe and to some extent to the US as well. And one of the policy mechanisms that I'd say that is maybe gaining the most traction when we are discussing right now is essentially cash instruments that enable Ukraine to scale innovation and production in country today, but partnered with European and US companies that have IP licenses and are able to manufacture the same items proven in the battlefield, certified to NATO standards, but then to sell them into markets around the world and to use the cash instrument that supports that as essentially a long-term subsidy to lower the cost of large contracts for that equipment being exported and sold into non-Ukrainian markets as well. So imagine I give you a loan. You don't have to repay it, but basically each unit of that loan discounts a future purchase that I will make of your product. All right. So I'm subsidizing my future contracts, but giving you cash immediately to be able to expand production. That mechanism basically does two things. Number one, it incentivizes competition and innovation within Ukraine and scaling of the things that actually work in the battlefield. It disincentivizes corruption and skimming from that because the cash is only worth something to the extent that you can scale and deliver on big contracts in the future. And it's palatable to Europeans because they're subsidizing their military capabilities over a long time horizon. I'd still say that we need outright grants, like real cash flowing into the Ukrainian economy without strings attached, because ultimately, to be frank, we, in terms of the US and Europe, caused this problem in the first place. And so we have not only a moral obligation, but an economic obligation to actually support Ukraine through it, right? We wouldn't be here if it weren't for Budapest Memorandum, and we wouldn't be here if it weren't for oil and gas pipelines flowing through to Germany and other places. And then second, obviously, longer term, you need Ukraine to have a solid economy, right, which is self-sustaining, and that means that it cannot be debt-ridden. So ultimately, there will be big debt forgiveness instruments or events that will have to take place because otherwise you're just going to create an economic crisis within the country after the war is over, and it will not be able to rebuild effectively, and it will cause monopolistic capture of certain sectors, and it will lead again to cronyism and issues with effectiveness of running the economy. So ultimately, it's going to be in Europe's best interest, especially Europe. But I would argue, if we had much longer, also on the positive benefits for the US of this arrangement. But obviously, Europe is much closer. And for Europe, it's an existential question, avoiding Ukraine losing a war that it will then have to fight elsewhere and that it's already fighting, uh, right? Versus providing the right support at arm's length in some sense, but not really, but at arm's length, which enables it to protect a lot more of its strategic industry and gives it more time to breathe while figuring out what the next 10 to 20 years will look like in practice with a neighbor posturing like Russia is towards it.
James, thank you so much, not only for this research, but for helping us understand these issues and separate the politics from the accounting, and also to understand what's really being spent, by whom, on what, and suggesting these great policy ideas that I hope will be implemented very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been Policy Implications. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and stay tuned for more conversations on Ukraine's economy, institutions, and the challenges of reconstruction. I also encourage you to donate to support Ukraine. You'll find information on trusted ways to do so in the episode description.